Because those were like more of a middle class thing. It was never like, oh no, these newspapers are correcting people.
No, although, I mean, there were working class newspapers, and middle class were wringing their hands about that a lot, especially the communists and socialists started putting on newspapers. And in fact, in the 1930s, the Communist Party in France came up with a new idea. They were going to do a monthly magazine called Regard, which means to look. And it was super glossy. It was about this big. And it was it was just photo spreads, lots of photos, and it was all communist themes, like here are the workers on strike, but it was beautiful photography and then a little bit of text around it, and it was trying to really make the communists look really human by having great pictures of communists laughing together or great scenes of family life or factories or whatever, and it really tried to use a sort of a glossy media format to sell communism. And it was pretty popular in France for a while, and then somebody took a copy of that to Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time, and said, is there some way you could do something with this? I mean, not communist, but like this format of photographs and a big thing like this, and just slice of life kind of articles, a little bit of text and a whole lot of photographs. He's like, yeah, we could call it Life. And in fact, that's where Life magazine came from. And so you get glossy magazines, and this is also the 1920s when you get the founding of Elle, Glamour, Cosmopolitan, glossy fashion magazines. But what I was getting to about mass media is that prior to World War I, there was no media event or anything that the entire country experienced at once. But during the 1920s, for the first time, you have radio, which had national broadcasts. So everybody in Germany could hear the same radio show at the same time. And we might take that for granted. In fact, it's sort of fracturing because now we've got the internet and nobody watches legacy media anymore. But it was a huge thing in sort of creating a common sense of German identity to have everybody in Germany having the same radio programs that they listen to every night. And the same thing happens in England and in France, etc. And so you get it helps build a sense of national cohesion that everybody is consuming the same media for the first time. And the same thing is happening with films. You now have national film releases, so people are going to the cinema and watching the same film in Hamburg that they're watching in Munich, that they're watching in Berlin, and perhaps even that it's the same film they're watching in Paris and New York and wherever. And so this creates mass media in a way that it had never had before. And this is where you get the first real mass media phenomena. And Charles Lindbergh is the perfect example of this. Everyone know who Charles Lindbergh is? Okay. He flew across the Atlantic in a single engine airplane alone. The airplane is the Spirit of St. Louis because he raised money from the city of St. Louis, and so he named the plane after them. But this was in 27, I think. Don't quote me on the date. But it was one of the first times that you really had a media frenzy. Lindbergh, everybody knew when Lindbergh took off because every radio station and newspaper in Europe was covering Lindbergh trying to do this. They had covered previous attempts. There previously been successful flights with 3 or 4 guys switching off who's pilot, but this is the first time a solo flight, and it was romantic and glamorous. Everybody knew it. In fact, and everybody was watching his progress. So like the radios were updating every hour. We got a radio message, Lindbergh is here, and then when he got to Paris, he landed at Le Bourget airfield. There were 30,000 people waiting for him on the runway. I mean, which is not a good idea. But he comes down in the middle of the night and lands, and the crowd mobbed him. They literally tore the plane apart because they were trying to get souvenirs, and a lot of it was fabric-covered wood. And then they almost killed Lindbergh. So many people were trying to congratulate him or whatever, he almost died in the crowd. And then they finally lifted him up on their shoulders and carried him off the airfield. And then they had, and then every country in Europe organized a massive parade for him. He got a parade in Paris, a parade in Berlin, a parade in London, and there's 30, 40, 50,000 people showing up for each one of these parades, and he turns into sort of this instant celebrity. And then he's later fascist, but
Imagine like you're landing after hours of flying like in the dark in this like airfield, and then all of a sudden like tens of thousands of people are ripping apart the plane you just landed and like trampling you.
yes, and I could just hear him going, I gotta go to the bathroom. I gotta go to the bathroom. And there were other things, and we talked about this in the gender course, but there was a case of a guy, I think it was in Tennessee or Kentucky, which was it? So remember? Anyway, he got his legs stuck in a cave.
Yes, my cave story.
And they were trying to get him out, and they couldn't figure out how to do it, but it turned into a media frenzy because all these radio stations started sending people down there to interview him, and he eventually died in the cave because they couldn't get him out. But there were thousands of people going to the cave to look, watch him die, basically, and he's being interviewed on radio, et cetera, and it's all over newspapers, all over the world. It's a crazy story, but this is the first time that anything like that happened in Western civilization or the world, that you got media frenzies over some story. Because previously, the guy gets stuck in a cave, it would have been an interesting story in the local newspaper, but it wouldn't, and maybe it would have been picked up as a little story in a farther away city, but it would not have been a national frenzy because you didn't have the radio sort of breathlessly narrating it, etc.
They preserved his body in the cave so that you could go and see it, and then for a really long time, and then it started to get all gross, so they had to put it in a coffin, but you could still go down there and see it until I think the 80s. I think the 80s was when they were we should not be doing this anymore.
I mean,
Crazy.
There's certain moments where they preserve bodies, and Lenin's body is still preserved. You can just go see him through the glass, and it's is this right?
Well, and some people tried to steal his body because they were this isn't right. We should get him out of there. And they tried to steal it, and then he ended up in a tree somewhere, and they had to get him out of the tree, and they put him back.
Just put him in the ground. Put him on the mantle.
You think of Saint Bones and stuff. And,
oh yeah, the relics.
Oh, the Catholics love that stuff. I remember when they came to our church, when I was in middle school, and you could touch a saint bone. That's also
I went to a couple churches when I visited Germany, and this one church I went to, literally on all four corners of the church was a saint's bones just sitting in this box covered in gold.
Wyatt and then Melissa.
I think St. Nicholas technically has 4 heads because each different church claims, no, we have the skull of St. Nicholas, no, we do, and they just can't, they keep disputing. And then one aspect, and I think it's Catholicism that I love, is that supposedly Jesus' foreskin is on the rings of Saturn when he ascended to heaven, is what I've heard.
That's so
bizarre.
That is something I did not see coming.
I was actually also going to mention Jesus' foreskin. There are so many churches that literally get into fights about which one of them has Jesus' foreskin.
What?
Yes. Well, little known fact, he had dozens of penises, so.
Catholics are crazy.
Okay, I think we've gotten a little off track here. I was talking about the 1920s.
That's such a weird thing where this is a point.
Right.
It's an odd point where when you think about archaeology, where a human body goes from being a body to being a thing, and it's really weird, and I hate it. I hate thinking about it. It's
Well, Native Americans would disagree with that. In fact, Jews would also. I mean, I was talking to a guy who was he's a Catholic priest, actually. I did not ask him about Saturn or Jesus' foreskin, but he, for the last 20, I actually met him probably 15 years ago, so, but 20 years previous to that, he had been traveling around Ukraine, identifying mass graves of people who were shot by the Nazis, Jews who were shot by the Nazis in the Holocaust, because the Nazis sent death squads around Ukraine and just go into a village and shoot all the Jews and bury them in a mass grave and move on. And so he was trying to identify all the mass graves, but he worked closely with the Jewish community in Ukraine, and they would allow him to do ground penetrating radar to see if there was if there were bodies buried there, but he could not dig them up because they're in the Jewish faith, you do not dig up a body once it's buried, you do not disturb it. So if that's where they're buried, that's where they're staying forever, and do not, so it was kind of an interesting thing. But Native Americans have an endless supply of disputes with archaeologists because they're digging up I don't know, are any of you going to Beloit after the Northland closes? You are? Beloit's interesting. It's actually built on an Indian burial ground. And there are burial mounds about 5 feet tall and 8-10 feet across all over campus. And they have a fantastic archaeological museum because they basically ran an archaeology program for decades digging up all the burial mounds. But then the Native American community around there is like, can you stop? and so they've actually worked pretty closely with the Native American community in the last 30 years or so. But for a while there, it was just like, let's just go dig up a burial mound. Today's class, we're going to go dig up this one.
That's a little crazy.
But they have a fantastic archaeological museum there. It really is, and an archaeology program. They no longer just dig up their own burial mounds. But it is a good archaeology program.
Wow.
That's why modern archaeology is important, because it's a lot more like, let's ask first instead of grave robbing.
Well, I mean, like, there was a time where they were finding mummies and, like, preserved Egyptian bodies and just grinding them up and selling them as pills, essentially.
Yeah, you used to be able to buy mummy pills.
Mummy juice. Yeah.
One other aspect of the 1920s is that there was an enormous change in sexual mores. You saw a glimpse of this in Gallipoli with all the officer telling the young man about sex and the doctor explaining, because they knew that all those soldiers going wherever were going to go see prostitutes. But the real, and so, I mean, in places like France and Germany, near the battlefront, you had a lot of brothels, you had a lot of sexual activity. And the very fact that young men would come back on leave and there was a whole lot of extramarital sex happening because people were working under the assumption of death. But also, the latex condom had been invented in the early to mid-19th century, but it had never been cheap or socially acceptable. It was considered to be something that only prostitutes used. So it was unrespectable. But after World War I, the use of condoms was so widespread among soldiers because the armies were actually handing out condoms in World War I because they didn't want soldiers getting sexually transmitted diseases, that there was a new acceptance of the condom afterwards. And so this is the first time, the first decade, where you actually see effective contraception. And there was a sexual sort of explosion after World War I. Sexual mores just basically crumbled. And part of this was because, for instance, in France, 10% of the men between the ages of 18 and 40 died in World War I. So there were 10% of the female population who were not going to get married, right? And one of the results of that was that a lot of women said, well, if I'm not going to get married, I'm just going to go ahead and have sex anyway. We've got condoms now. But also, for instance, in the hyperinflation in Germany, so many middle-class families got wiped out, and lots of people turned to prostitution. And Berlin in particular, but Paris was similar, but Berlin in particular became the sexual debauchery capital of the world in the early 1920s. There were official prostitutes who were sanctioned by the state and they had a license to practice. They were called control girls because they were under state control. But there was also illegal prostitution everywhere. And Berlin's prostitution scene was absolutely crazy. There were prostitutes called boot girls who wore lace-up knee-high boots of different colors, and the color told you which kink they catered to. So if you wanted to beat them up while you were having sex with them, you picked that color, and if you wanted to be tied up and whipped, that color, BDSM, that color. You have a pee fetish, that color. You have a poop fetish, that color. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then there were certain streets that became known for particular kinks. If you wanted to have sex with a pregnant woman, Mundstrasse in Berlin was all pregnant prostitutes all the time. And so prostitutes who happened to get pregnant would be working over there, and then they'd go to Mundstrasse when they began to show, because there were certain people who would pay to have sex with a pregnant woman. If you wanted to have a mother-daughter team, you could hire a prostitute with daughters as young as 9 and have sex with the mother and the daughter at the same time. If you wanted children, there were taxi girls, which were, you could call up a pimp and he would put a 10-year-old girl in a taxi and send her to your hotel, and you could do whatever you wanted. There were cabarets that had strip shows, and I mean, the pictures of cabaret shows are off the charts, but I mean, basically you'd have 30 or 40 naked women on stage dancing, or sometimes they were just risque, women in lingerie singing and dancing, or there's a whole range of cabaret shows. But and there were cross-dressing, and there were gay prostitutes, and anything you wanted was available in Berlin if you had money, sexually speaking.
Was this like a thing that was like kind of unique to Berlin, and like the people in Berlin were like kind of participating in this, or was this like something that was kind of known throughout Europe, and like people were going to people were going to Berlin?
I think it's both. There was a significant just sort of local Berlin clientele, but Berlin did become known as a sort of sex capital of the world, and if you wanted, anonymous sex, Berlin was the place to go. But Paris had a similar scene. It wasn't quite as extreme as Berlin. They didn't have boot girls in Paris. But London, it was a Europe-wide phenomenon, this sort of sexual liberation. Why?
I mean, is this why the Germans still to this day have that kind of reputation? I feel like I have heard one or two things about Germany as being, especially in Europe,
Well, part of that is Marlene Dietrich. She, in 1929, there's a film came out called The Blonde Venus. Blue Angel. And in it, she plays Marlene Dietrich plays a cabaret singer. And for most of the film, she's in lingerie up on stage singing sexually suggestive songs. And it became a big hit. And she came to the United States and made a whole bunch more movies, often involving her dressing up as a man, and sort of lesbian themes and sexual suggestion and etc. And it's because she had a strong German accent, although she was fluent in English, she had a strong German accent, and she became the sort of stereotype of the German temptress who had a deep voice and sang a sort of husky, sexually suggestive songs, but also had a certain sort of dominating, destructive, sadistic streak. I think it's her that spread the idea that Germans are, sexually really twisted and into BDSM.
Ship of Fools?
I don't know. She made a bunch of movies in Hollywood. I mean, she basically made The Blue Angel in Germany, and then both the director and her went to Hollywood and started making films, and she made a whole series of films in Hollywood in the 30s. And she was actually not able to go back to Germany because she was really critical of Hitler and Nazism, and so Germany just sort of cut her off, and she was stuck in the US forever. But there are, anytime you see in any movie or anywhere you see a woman in lingerie singing a sexually suggestive song in some sort of cabaret setting, it's a takeoff of The Blue Angel. Any other question? The 1920s also saw the beginning of a gay rights movement. There was in Berlin, there was an institute founded for the scientific study of sexuality, founded by a guy named Magnus Hirschfeld. And he basically argued that homosexuality was a normal variation of human sexuality. He actually argued there was a third sex. There was heterosexual male and heterosexual female, and then the third sex, which was homosexual men or women. And he did all sorts of studies and he tried to do surveys and things on sexuality, et cetera. And so he was trying to basically legitimize homosexuality. There were a whole slew of gay bars in Berlin. The most famous was the El Dorado, which was famous for attracting men who were cross-dressing. I don't know today whether you're talking about drag or cross-dressing or trans men, because they didn't have those terms then, and they didn't, we don't know who was doing what there. So, But there were sex clubs, there were nudist colonies. Berlin was big on nudism, and you would have these nudist colonies where you would basically have a little private park, and they would have little tents, basically huts set up, and people would do exercises nude and play sports nude, and then when they got horny, they'd go have sex in the huts, and so they were sort of combination of nudist and sex club. Anything you wanted could happen in Berlin. It was.
If only Germany didn't have that whole thing happen in the 30s.
Well, in part, some of the support for Hitler was a reaction against that.
The Germans were like, y'all freaks in Berlin need to chill out.
Exactly, and they were like, this is decadent and wrong, and one of Hitler's big things was, I'll clean it up. Which was ironic because the head of the SA, a guy named Ernst Röhm, was gay and was one of the biggest frequenters of the sex clubs, the gay sex clubs in Berlin. But the Nazis shut them all down. They shut down Magnus Hirschfeld. And that was one of their big things, was that, if you hate all the sexual promiscuity in Berlin, we'll shut it down. We're the ones to clean it up. Any questions about that?
Sorry.
The 1920s also saw a really vigorous debate about the role of women in society. And the reason for that, there's a couple of reasons for that all come together. One is, the sexual liberation. It's like, well, what is acceptable sexual behavior for a woman? Is she allowed to have sex outside of marriage? Is, et cetera, et cetera. But there were a couple other things. As I mentioned, 10% of the male population between 18 and 40 in France had died in World War I, and wasn't quite as high numbers, but similar percentages, 8%, 9% of German men had died, or English men, et cetera. And so there was an entire generation of young women who realized they might very well not get married, and middle class young women realized they might not get married, and so they began to get jobs to support themselves. And lots of women had entered the workforce during World War I. Over 1 million women in England and France had entered the workforce. Middle class women who had not been working before entered the workforce during the war for patriotic reasons. They were going to help the country win the war. But when the war ended, lots of them stayed in the workforce because their husbands had died in the war, or because they realized they were unlikely they were going to work until they got married, but they never did. And so Europe as a whole had to suddenly sort of deal with the fact that there's a significant number of women who are now middle-class women who are now working and supporting themselves and in charge of their own lives, and they're never going to be married. And that was a status that simply didn't exist. There were working-class women who didn't get married before that, but middle-class women either got married or they were spinsters. Their families sort of hid them away and supported them. But to have a single middle-class woman out supporting herself as a secretary or whatever was really unheard of. And then all the sexual liberation was really unheard of. And so I'm going to talk about France for a minute because we have a really good history of that. But one of the things that people began to do is they began to debate the role of women in society, the proper role of women in society. And there's a historian named Mary Louise Roberts who studied France, in particular in the 1920s and 30s, and talked about how people debated all this stuff. Was the mass media good? Was all the sexual liberation good? Was all the economic changes good? All the new technology and new products, is that good? And they did it, Roberts argues, by arguing about the proper role of women. And so they basically, she said, came up with 3 sort of stereotypes of women. There was the traditional stay-at-home mom, right? And then there was the single working girl who was supporting herself, and then there was the flapper. And the flapper became the symbol of all the liberation and all the debauchery and all the everything that was possible in the 20s. When I say a flapper, does that mean anything to anybody? If you think of the image, that, if you watch, I don't know, The Great Gatsby with what's his name? Leonardo DiCaprio. Think about the women at those parties. Those are flappers, okay? So before World War I, middle-class women wore, the standard outfit for middle-class women was a skirt that went all the way to the ground, and it usually had a bustle, a big thing of fabric back here, and it usually had some petticoats under there or something to make the skirt puff out. And then you would wear a corset to make your waist really thin. My mother tells me my great-grandmother had an 18-inch waist when she had a corset on. And so you wear the corset to make your waist really thin. The skirt would make your hips look really big, and then the corset tends to push everything up, and so you tend to have a very prominent bust, but you don't have any décolletage. You don't show anything off. The dress goes all the way up, buttons all the way up, a sort of turtleneck right up to the neck. You've got big puffy sleeves that come right down to very tight cuffs at the bottom, and then you wear boots that go halfway up the calf. And the idea is that this outfit suggests motherhood. It emphasizes breasts and hips, but it does not suggest sexuality. There is no skin showing. There is nothing that's no leg showing. Everything is covered up. So it's supposed to suggest motherhood without sexuality. Right? And this goes back to what we were talking about over here, that middle-class women were not supposed to be interested in sex, etc. They were supposed to be interested in motherhood, but not sex. After the war, women's fashions changed dramatically in the early 20s. Dress skirts start going up to above the knee. You start seeing other different types of high heels that are, pumps, and then, slingbacks, and all sorts of shoes that are much flimsier than the old lace-up boots that women wore in the 19th century. We saw in the very long engagement, you saw a bit of, how much clothing that woman was wearing when she was going to have sex with her husband's friend, et cetera. And suddenly flappers, the dresses that flappers were usually much looser. They were not pulled in at the corset was totally out, and dresses were usually loose around the waist now. They were often sleeveless so that you would see the entire arm, you could see the entire calf, and they often had deep décolletage, so you were showing off some décolletage. And part of it was these dresses were great for dancing. All the new dances, the Charleston and the jitterbug and all these dances that came along in the 20s that were not the waltz or the tango, etc. Actually, dancing is another place where every time there's a new dance craze, people say it's the end of civilization. When the waltz emerged, people thought it was totally sexualized and decadent because you're dancing hip to hip, and that was just the end of civilization. And then the tango comes along, and oh my God, that's even more end of civilization. And then the Charleston comes along, and you have a woman in a short dress, flinging her legs around, and oh my God, it's the end of civilization. And then you get the twist and that's the end of civilization.
Don't even get me started.
And you get twerking, and that's the end of civilization.
The whip and the nay-nay.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking about. I was like, no one said that was the end of civilization.
So the flapper it becomes a sort of a stereotypical image of the liberated woman. And I'm just going to sort of give you a stereotype of the flapper. She's a 20-something woman who has a job and has her own money and lives on her own and is not under the control of a man. And she wears these skimpy dresses, and she goes out to bars, and she smokes cigarettes, and she drinks the new cocktails, Manhattans and martinis and old fashions and whatever. And she dances the Charleston to jazz. And jazz music was really big at this time period. And it was a fantastic time to be an African-American musician, because African-American musicians could go over to Europe and make bazillions of dollars just touring around playing jazz, because everyone in Europe wanted it, and they thought it was only authentic if it was played by African-Americans. And so she's going to listen to African-American music and dance to the, jazz was seen as chaotic music. It wasn't classical music, it was chaotic and weird for Europeans. And so she's listening to jazz music, she's dancing the Charleston, she's buying her own car, she's having sex, she's drinking cocktails, she's smoking, she's wearing revealing clothing, and she's supporting herself. She's not under the control of a man. Right? So flappers flappers cut their hair short. This is where you get the page boy and the garçon. The French actually have the French word for a flapper is la garçon, which is interesting because garçon is the French word for boy, and it's masculine, but they made it feminine by adding an N-E at the end of it, so it's the girly boy or the feminine boy or whatever. And they called both the haircut, the short haircut, la garçon, and flappers were la garçon. And so the short hair, 19th century women were supposed to have very long hair, and you were only supposed to let your hair down with your husband when you were having sex, so nobody ever saw your hair down unless you were going to have sex. So that phrase, let your hair down, is really suggestive. So the flapper becomes the image of sexual liberation, mass media, there are flappers in all the movies and things like that. It becomes a symbol of decadence, it becomes a symbol of personal happiness. The flapper becomes a symbol of consumer culture. The flapper becomes a symbol of women's liberation. The flapper even becomes a symbol of women voting, because in most European countries, women got the vote for the first time after World War I. And then there's the traditional stay-at-home mom image. But then over the 20s, they sort of work out this image of a respectable working girl. The middle-class girl who doesn't wear the complete flapper outfit, but her dresses are a little shorter, a little stylish, but more conservative, don't show off as much. And she goes to work, she supports herself, but she does not go out drinking cocktails and having sex and smoking. She goes home at night and she reads Flaubert or something. And so they're sort of trying to debate what do we think is acceptable in society, and what they're not debating what's acceptable for men to do, because men are going out and dancing in Charleston also, but nobody's questioning that. But they debated about women. Do we like flappers? Sometimes no. And do we like stay-at-home moms? Well, sometimes that's too stodgy. Do we like working class girls who are respectable? Well, that's acceptable. And so this really becomes a sort of a culture war, in the sense that we have culture wars about abortion or trans rights or whatever today, and it really marks you off as belonging to this camp or that camp. If you're pro-flapper, you belong to one camp, and if you're pro-stay-at-home mom, you belong to the other camp, and et cetera. Any questions about that? All right, so let's take a 5-minute break, and then at 22 we will start watching Saving Private Ryan.